The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 2. The next morning, Mother set about cleaning the house, even though she always keeps it spotless. I think it was more an effort to keep herself busy and quiet her nerves than anything else. Cleaning has a Kava-like effect on her. Duffy followed her around, looking up at her with that anxious attentiveness that only a Westie can truly achieve. Peter and I were relegated to transforming my home office into a proper bedroom. Temporarily losing my office wasn't a big sacrifice, since I'd all but completely let my business go after getting tangled up with the CIA. I had been a freelance graphic artist, but let my work dwindle down to one old and valued client. I guess hanging on allowed me to believe that if my part-time position as homo in residence for the government ever fell through, I'd have something to fall back on. Peter, on the other hand, has managed to hold on to his own job at Farhut's, the chick men's clothing store, despite taking an extraordinarily amount of time off to spy. He likes to think the freedom he's giving is because he's a very good salesman, but personally I believe Arthur Dingle, his boss, has kept him on because Dingle is a lonely older man who hopes someday our marriage might dissolve and Peter will turn to him for solace. Dreams of comforting the widow have kept many a man going in old age. The second floor room I use as an office was equipped with a daybed with a cover patterned with large maple leaves and matching curtains that Mother made in one of her frequent flights of domesticity. And there was a collapsible drafting table and a desk that held my PC. We wanted to make the room as homey as we could, so I closed the table and put it in the hall closet. Then we moved my computer equipment to the floor of the closet in our bedroom. We then pushed the desk against the far wall and positioned the bed under the window. "Well, you think we should bring that little dresser up from the basement?" Peter asked. "I think there's enough room in the closet for his fatigues." "Alex, I'm sorry. I didn't sleep well last night, okay?" "I know, I was there. You're really worried about this, aren't you?" I sighed heavily. "If you can go by my dreams, I'm actually only worried that Saddam Hussein will get me." "You're kidding." "No. He broke into our house and came slithering into our room in every way humanely possible, and some that weren't. The last time he crawled in through an air duct like Bruce Willis." Peter came over and gave me a kiss on the forehead. "You don't have to worry, honey. I don't think anyone could fit in the air vents in this house." I pushed him away playfully. "You're a big help." When we went downstairs, we found Mother vacuuming while whistling. I whistle a happy tune. When she does Deborah Kerr on me, I know she's not as confident as she would like us to believe. "Do you think we should get some flowers for his room?" she said over the noise of the machine. "I think he'll be satisfied with indoor plumbing," I replied. "What do you want us to do next?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small sheet of paper. "Here's a list of the groceries we need to lay in. I do hope he'll like the food. I have no idea what he's used to." I looked up from the sheet. She raised a warning finger at me. "Whatever it is, don't say it." Peter and I spent about an hour at the grocery store, then returned with a trunk load of bags that we toted to the kitchen and placed on the table. Mother had stowed the vacuum and was polishing the dining chair when our arrival interrupted her. She stored the rag and the lemon-scented polish and set about putting the groceries away. It's not that we were unwilling to do it, but Mother rules the kitchen and is never quite satisfied with the way we arrange things, even though we've always put them exactly where she does. By the time we'd gotten the guest room in order, finished the shopping, disposed of the bags, and polished the house to a blinding shine, it was still not quite noon. All we had left to do was have lunch, something Mother was loath to do for fear our soon-to-be resident soldier might see a latent crumb on the table, and then spend the rest of the day waiting for the arrival of our guest and his escorts. There is something both anticlimactic and anxiety-producing about being ready too early, particularly when you don't know when an event is going to take place. Peter and I sat on the couch, alternately crossing and uncrossing our legs and smoothing out the cushions, while watching a string of Charlie Chan videos, a slight regression to my childhood, during which a local television station showed the films every Sunday. There's something comforting about Charlie Chan. He's soft-spoken in a way that will cure even my worst bouts of insomnia. Mother sat at the dining table, leaning forward so as not to dull the chair's newly polished back, and pretending to read the latest edition of Condé Nast Traveler. It was 4 o'clock when the doorbell finally rang. We all froze in place for a moment, then got up and headed for the door. "It doesn't want 3 of us," Mother said, somewhat sharply, effectively stopping Peter and me in our tracks. She opened the door and said, "Good afternoon, Larry." "Jean," he replied before coming into view. She took a step back, and Nelson walked into the doorway, where he stopped and turned sideways. He extended his arm inward, signaling the visitor to enter. My mouth dropped open when I saw him. I'd been expecting the soldier to be a big, burly, hairy-backed, unshaven monster in camouflage gear, with ammo belts crisscrossing his chest and unpleasant smells wafting off of him. The last thing I expected was when I had just come through the door. He had short, neatly combed black hair, dark skin, and even darker brown eyes. His lashes were long and black, and his eyebrows, which I'd imagined would look like unkempt hedgerows, was so neat and straight I suspected he'd had them trimmed. And he looked to be about 14 years old. He wore a pair of tan Dockers, a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and had a dark green duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was followed in by Nelson, another man who seemed to be the same general make as Nelson, but nowhere near as suave. Mother closed the door after them. "Let me introduce Jean Reynolds," Nelson said. "Jean, this is James Paschal." "Nice name," I intoned. "How'd you do?" Mother said, offering her hand and stopping just short of a curtsy. He spoke with an odd combination of fluidity and haltiness, like a river of light syrup hitting an occasional rock. He gave her hand one brisk shake. "Very nice to have me," Nelson continued. "And this is Alex Reynolds." He grabbed my hand and gave it one strong yank. "Nice to have you." Looked into those big brown eyes that were clearly striving for sincerity. I realized what he was really trying for was, "Nice of you to have me." Peter received the same abrupt shake and greeting. Then the 4 of us turned back to Nelson. He inclined his head towards the companion and said, "And this is Agent George Dunning, who will be helping with the debriefing." Dunning had a square head and small eyes that made him look as if he were squinting. His nose was a bit too large to be in proportion to his face, and his lips were thin and flat. We all muttered greetings at him simultaneously, and he grunted in reply. "Jean," said Nelson, "James has had a long trip and is very tired. If it's all right, we thought we'd leave him with you for the rest of the day and begin the debriefing tomorrow." "Of course," Mother said, casting a sympathetic eye over the boy. "Why don't I show you your room?" She put her arm over his shoulder, and he flinched, like someone who's been abused and mistrusts any unexpected contact. If Mother noticed, she didn't show it. She also didn't relent. She guided him to the stairs, and they started up. Dunning slewed his eyes to Nelson and said, "I'll check it out," and followed them up the stairs. The muscle in Nelson's cheek flexed slightly. I had a feeling he just prevented himself from smiling. "What's this all about, Nelson?" I demanded once Peter and I were alone with him. "What do you mean?" "That kid's in the Iraqi army. He looks like he's barely out of puberty. What are you trying to pull?" He allowed a significant pause before responding. "He's not from Chicago, Alex. He's 18 years old, and he's been in the army for 4 years. I assure you that he is in a position to have the information we want." "Oh, I'm sorry." I felt put in my place. but not enough to lose the feeling that Nelson hadn't told us everything. Did he come off the plane looking like that, or did you guys fix him up? We provided him with new clothing, of course. He looked like he's been to Supercuts. They get the occasional haircut in Iraq. I sighed. All right. What's bothering you, Alex? Well, when you said you were bringing an Iraqi soldier here, I pictured a middle-aged man with a spittoon. Don't ask me why, but this is just a kid. You brought him to a strange country, and you're going to keep him in our house just for a few days. Then what? Tag him and release him into the wild? No, of course. We'll set him up in life, and he'll have an agent assigned to him for a while to help him make the transition and teach him about life here. Once again, he almost smiled. Will that be satisfactory? I stared at him for several seconds. It was anything but satisfactory, but there was no point in arguing with Nelson. If he had something up his sleeve, he wasn't about to give it up. I guess it'll have to be. He didn't get the chance to respond. Mother chose that moment to come back down the stairs, followed closely by Dunning. He's going to lie down for a while, the poor darling, said Mother. The moment he saw the bed, he fair fell into it. She turned an accusing eye at Nelson, who she seemed to hold personally responsible for the boy's exhaustion. I'll bet he looks like an angel when he's asleep, I said. Peter leaned close to my ear. Honey, would you please stop it? Well, we'll leave him in your hands for now, said Nelson. He shouldn't be any trouble. We'll be back at 9 in the morning to get started. We're staying at the Imperial Inn, Lakeshore. If you need to contact us, Jean. He gave a slight nod to her, then to us. He and Dunning then left, the later without saying a word. If I didn't know better, I'd say you cowed our Nelson, I said to Mother. She knit her brow. Whatever do you mean? You looked at him like he'd personally been torturing the boy. I did not, she said firmly. Then she added, but it wouldn't have surprised me if your CIA has been worrying that young man with questions ever since they got him on the plane. My CIA? Mother, you sometimes forget you're an American citizen. She folded her arms and curled one corner of her lip. I believe you know what I mean. Oh, of course. She meant the CIA I'd foolishly gotten us involved with. It didn't matter that she enjoyed that involvement as much as I did. A fact that I knew far better than to point out at that moment. You should have seen the way he looked at the bed. The poor dear probably hasn't slept in days. He's safe now, said Peter. He'll be able to get some rest. The three of us fell silent. Mother's eyes were narrowed, and she appeared to be mentally castigating whoever had ill-treated the boy, and Peter was looking at the floor, his brow furrowed. We were all at a loss. We'd been expecting the house to be a flurry of activity once our guest had arrived. The last thing we expected him to do was fall asleep the moment he crossed the threshold. So, what do we do now? I asked. Mother shrugged. Have some tea. It was well we had a snack, because at 7 o'clock our soldier was still fast asleep. I looked in on him once and found him lying on top of the covers, fully dressed with his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them, like he was ducking and rolling from a Scud missile in his dreams. I had only meant to peek in and see if he was all right, but I stayed and watched him for a while, overcome by sadness. This kid was about half my age, and he'd probably already seen more atrocities than most Americans will personally witness in a lifetime. The thought of it made me feel that I really hadn't experienced much of life, despite my status as an occasional agent. It was then that I noticed something unnerving. In the dim light, I could just barely see some crescents of white. His eyes, which I could have sworn had been completely closed, were open to slits. He was watching me. I quietly backed out of the room and closed the door. When I went downstairs, Peter was staring at yet another Charlie Chan movie with glazed eyes. He didn't grow up in Chicago. Mother was waiting at the foot of the stairs. How's he doing? He's still asleep. She studied my face. Is something the matter? No, I was just thinking he must have had a very hard life. She smiled and gently touched her fingers to my cheek. It'll be better for him from now on. Apparently she was happy to hear something other than fear-motivated bilge coming out of me. Right. Now I'm going to get dinner started. It should be ready for 8. We'll get our young man up then. He has to have a proper meal, and then he can go right back to bed if he likes. She clapped her hands together as if to punctuate her plan, then breezed off to the kitchen. Within the hour, Mother had whipped up 3 huge shepherd's pies, roughly enough for 12 people. A shepherd's pie is considered simple fare by British standards, but it's one of our favorites. Since we had known when our guest would arrive, it would have been impractical to attempt anything more elaborate for his first dinner with us. Earlier in the day, Mother had thrown together a raspberry trifle. For dessert, they wanted only the finishing touch of whipped cream. At 8 o'clock, everything was ready. Peter and I had set up the table, and the food was laid out. Mother stood at the head of the table for a moment, surveying her work with satisfaction, then needlessly straightened the twin blue candlesticks. Before lighting them, our guest was still in bed. Will you go and wake him? Mother said to me. Okay. I went up the stairs and down the hall to the door of my office. This time, I knocked before entering. When there was no reply, I opened the door quietly and looked in. He was no longer curled up in a ball, but had stretched out with his hands at his sides. He still looked awfully rigid. James, I said softly. He didn't respond, so I repeated his name a bit more loudly. This time his nose twitched, and after a pause, his entire body kicked into motion sluggishly like a drugged machine. James? He rolled his head sideways and looked at me. James? He repeated questioningly, his voice heavy with sleep. Then he remembered that this was his new name. Oh, yes. Hello. Dinner is ready. Why don't you come down and eat? You can come back to bed right after that, if you want. Yes. He sat up and was still for a moment, disoriented and trying to get his bearings. Then he rose and came over to me. I am so sorry. I have been very tired. That doesn't surprise me. We stepped out into the hallway and he squinted as his eyes adjusted to the light. Do you have some place to wash? I had to think about that one for a second. Oh, yeah, the bathroom. Right over here. I led him to the doorway. The blue towels are for you to use. Do you know how to? Do you need any help? He looked faintly scandalized. I do not need help. Thank you. He went in and closed the door, but didn't lock it. I didn't want to wait by the door, because if someone did that to me, it would defeat my purpose. So I went down the hall and stood by the head of the stairs. After a couple of minutes, I heard the toilet flush, then the door opened, and he joined me. We went down the stairs together. Ah, James, said Mother, giving him her warmest hostess smile. I hope you enjoyed your little nap. Yes. Well, have a seat here, and we'll have something to eat. She motioned to the chair at the foot of the table. His big brown eyes goggled at the sight of the spread. I don't know if it was because he was amazed at the amount of food that Mother had prepared for 4 people, or if he was just mystified by his first glimpse of a shepherd's pie. As usual, Mother had made decorative tracks across the top of the mashed potatoes with a fork before browning them. I wouldn't have been surprised if this was the first time James had ever seen food given any sort of presentation. Mother sat at the head of the table, and Peter and I took our places on either side. As always, Duffy sat quietly at her feet. There was an uncomfortable pause. Then Mother said, Peter, why don't you pass me James' plate, and I'll serve out. He complied, and I inwardly winced when I saw distress flash across our guest's face, as if he thought he was being robbed of his dinner. But it quickly disappeared when Mother snatched up the serving spoon and began to heap food onto his plate. Would you like some bread? She asked as she replaced the spoon. Yes, please. His eyes were riveted on his plate. She folded back the cloth that covered the basket of bread and added 2 dinner rolls to his plate, then passed it back to him without waiting. James grabbed up his spoon and started shoveling the food into his mouth with an unbridled abandon that was absolutely mesmerizing. He ate as if he were afraid that at any moment someone might snatch the food from him. For all I know, they might have done that to him in the army. Mother quickly filled our plates and her own, apparently not wanting to embarrass our guest with eating alone. And we dug in, next to James, who grasped his spoon like a spade and barely took a breath between mouthfuls. The three of us, with our properly held forks and irregular pauses, looked positively dainty, but I was fascinated by James, whose obvious enjoyment of the meal bordered on bacchanalian. It was an awfully stark contrast to the quasi-formal dinner we'd attended the night before. I had one of those moments when I wondered what the hell our lives had become. We ate in awkward silence until we'd actually sat down with him. I hadn't realized exactly how hard it would be to make small talk with an Iraqi soldier. Actually, the soldier part probably didn't matter that much. It would have been hard to do it with anybody who'd been dropped into our dining room from a foreign country. I tried to think of things to say, but failed. I mean, how about those curds, huh? Hardly seemed appropriate. Peter, Mother, and I exchanged glances here and there, silently prodding each to start the conversation. It was Mother who finally took a stab at it. "So, James, how do you like America?" "I do not," he replied with his mouth full. Her eyes widened. I beg your pardon?" I say that wrong. I mean, I do not know. I only have some plain and room. The rooms have been nice." She broke into a smile. "I see." The ensuing silence was broken only by the sounds of James's spoon scraping against his plate. Clearly this was going to be harder than we'd imagined. We were naturally curious about his home country and why he'd wanted to leave it, particularly since Nelson had implied that James had a secret reason for defecting. But I was afraid that asking him about it might be misinterpreted as an interrogation, and he'd doubtlessly already had enough of that, or would soon. And what was there left to talk about? His future plans? So far as we knew, he didn't know them. I made the next attempt. "So, James, what do you hope to do now that you're here?" He paused in mid-shovel, his eyes wide and those long, thick lashes making him look like a big, dark doll. "I will answer questions." No, I don't mean now that you're here in this house. I mean, now that you're in this country." "Ah, I will settle." A cloud crossed his face. "Somewhere," he resumed eating. "You don't know where yet?" Peter asked. "I do not know America as well. I do not hear much about it, except that everyone has much money." "Oh, not everyone," I said. "I don't hear talk of many American places in my country, except maybe for California, New York. They say there are many people there." There are, especially in New York. I'm used to many people, but I worry. Now I'm here, I worry about fitting in. "Well, you speak English well enough to live in New York. Where'd you learn it?" He paused in his eating again, eyeing me suspiciously. I added quickly, "I only wondered. I mean, I didn't realize that they taught English in your country at all." He gave me a half smile. "I understand that. In America, people learn only one language, but English is very confusing." I was certainly finding it confusing at that moment. He picked up one of his dinner rolls and started to mop the surface of his plate with it. "He's right, you know," Mother chimed in, trying to ease any embarrassment over the slight, intended or otherwise, to her adoptive country. "Even in England, we learn French as a second language. But over here, they tend to only learn English." "Well, that takes up most of our time," I said, James popped the damp roll into his mouth and chewed it noisily while cleaning his plate with the second one. "There's plenty more if you like," said Mother. He looked up with delight as if the thought of seconds were beyond his comprehension. He handed his plate back to her. She refilled it, and we spent the rest of the meal watching in amazement as he quickly polished it off with unflagging gusto. When he'd finished that and had some dessert, he sat back in his chair and sighed deeply. "This is good." His eyelids suddenly drooped, and I realized how exhausted he really was. "You want to go back to bed, don't you?" Mother said sympathetically. "I am very tired." He made no move, apparently not feeling he had the freedom of the house. We once again found ourselves in an awkward position. It seemed as if none of us could think of a way to tell him he could go on up without sounding as if we were sending him to his room. After a moment, Mother looked at me significantly and cocked her head toward the staircase. "Oh," I said stupidly. "Well, I'll show you back up." He smiled gratefully. The two of us rose, and I led him upstairs. "You know, while you stay with us, you really can do what you want," I explained when we reached his doorway. I mean, if you want to go to bed, you can just do it. You don't need our permission or anything." His forehead was lowered, and he looked up at me from under his eyebrows as if concentrating hard to understand what I was saying. The meaning seemed to catch up with him a few seconds after I finished speaking. "Thank you," he said simply. "Now, if you need anything during the night, just come and get us. Peter and I are in that room." I pointed to the door at the front of the hall. "I took your room?" No, I said easily, trying to allay his evident concern. "That's just my office. I don't use it much." "Office?" He looked very confused. "I think you work for government." "I do sometimes." I pulled out my wallet and withdrew one of my old business cards, which mostly serve as scratch paper now. "See, I used to have a design business." He took it. "So I do not take your room?" "No, that's our room. We share it." His smooth young brow furrowed. "In house with so many rooms, you stay in same room?" "Yes," I replied after a beat. "Your brothers, no?" Oh boy, I thought. It had been over 20 years since I'd been in the closet, and I never shrink from being open about myself, but with all James had to digest already, no pun intended, I didn't think it was the time or place to further tax his understanding by trying to explain my relationship with Peter. Hell, I didn't even know if he'd gotten far enough in his English lessons for me to attempt it anyway. "No, we're not brothers," I stammered. It's just always been our home, our room." "Oh," he looked even more confused. "Yes," I quickly added. "Good night." I retreated. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.